first time I ever spoke to you, I cried because I was talking about a child victim of war who had been gang raped by Serbian soldiers and had watched her family being killed, and some of the females being raped as well. And it was really difficult for me to talk about. And I think last year I talked to you about sex, and I didn't cry at all. And you'll be interested to know that the paper, the academic paper that I wrote about last year's topic, was accepted by a scientific peer-reviewed journal. And when the peers, and it's a blind review, when the peers wrote an evaluation of it, and presumably they're scientists, they said, she certainly understands science, but she doesn't know anything about law. So when that comes out, I'll be sure to send it out to you so that you can see, how it was written up from a scientific perspective. After receiving that feedback, I did stop dumbing down the law for the scientists and instead tried to treat it much more robustly. And then after that, the editor was happy and the other peer reviewers signed off on it, and it'll be out in the next few months. But in the meanwhile, well, we've been trying to get that into publication. I continued some work that I was doing before that I never really talked to you or anybody else about because it was pretty confidential and nobody really knew what was going on. And basically what's been happening is that for a number of years now, we've had a significant number of children coming to the U.S. from the Northern Triangle, so Central American countries such as Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador. And some of you might be familiar with the history of the U.S. involvement in the region and the fact that those countries don't really have a stable, neutral state. And so economies are failing. Gangs have run rampant, and it's not unusual for the gangs to target young children, and by young, I mean sometime usually between the ages of 7 to 10, and recruit them into their gangs and force them to become runners, where they're running drugs or running money, and then once a young girl around the age of 10 to 13 starts to develop, that it's very common for gang members to take a girl that they are attracted to and to force her to be his girlfriend. And if she doesn't, normally they will rape her anyway, and sometimes they will kill her. In addition to that, the parents who have been successful with businesses often will be forced to pay taxes to the gangs in order to support their criminal activity. And if they don't, then the gang members will kill a member of the family, and sometimes the parents themselves. And so their choice is to either turn over the money that they've made that day or else be killed. Another situation that we hear about that happens a lot is that someone becomes a witness to a crime, and crime's really rampant. And so after they become a witness to the crime, they're often targeted by the gangs to be killed because they don't want any witnesses to their criminal activity. Sometimes they're threatened beforehand and told if they tell anybody, that they will be killed or their children will be killed. But lots of opportunities for gangs to terrorize innocent people's lives. And as a result of that, we have seen an increase in children coming up from Central America through Mexico and to the border. And there have been, basically every single president in recent decades has been trying to deal with these children and figure out how to care for them, because there are certain international laws that require us to meet certain standards with regard to their claims of asylum. And so I've been going to the border facilities and have government clearance to interview these children and to inspect the facilities to make sure that they meet the standards that have been set up. But I didn't talk about it a lot because nobody really seemed to care. Nobody else was talking about it. And then what happened was, year before last, unbeknownst to you, unbeknownst to me, the border workers, so by the border workers I mean both the NGOs and some of the government workers, started to see something that they had never seen before on a widespread basis, which was children being separated from their parents on a much more widespread basis than they had ever witnessed before. And it has been common practice for all of the administrations to separate children at the border from their parents if the parent was abusive, or if the parent didn't appear to be a parent and instead was somebody who was smuggling the child, or if it appeared that the person was a coyote. In addition to that, if the parent had a significant criminal history, and by significant criminal history, I mean a felon. So this had to be someone who posed a danger, who needed to be arrested and imprisoned by the U.S. officials, and the child needed to be taken care of somewhere else. But what started to happen is that children were being separated from parents who didn't meet any of those categories. And no one, the people who were watching this in 2017 were saying, this can't be right. This has to be my imagination. This must just be a fluke. That officer didn't know what they were doing. And then in 2018, they started seeing these children routinely being removed, every single child, almost, from almost every single parent. And it was like, my God, what is going on here? I want you to imagine for a moment that you are a parent and your son is being recruited by a gang and he's 9 years old, or a gang keeps coming to your business and demanding that you pay them money every day or they're going to kill your daughter. Or imagine that your husband has been killed and that they're coming after your daughter to become their sex slave. What are you going to do? Are you going to remain in a failed state and allow them to kill, rape, maim your family one by one? Sometimes they do it to the entire family all in one fell swoop. Well, if you are strong, if you have resolve, if you have strong survival instincts, you're going to move. And that's part of what we've started to see. If you put yourself in their shoes and think about what does it take for a person to put a child on their back and maybe siblings, at each arm, and to travel often by foot almost 1,000 miles to a place that you've never seen before, and to endure heat, hunger, thirst on the way with your children in tow, then you know that you are in a state of crisis in your life to go to that extreme. And I want you to imagine that you've done that you've packed up the kids and you are on foot and you get to the United States, and all of a sudden, there is a river in front of you. And imagine that as you are climbing into a boat, a little dinghy, with your kids and some other families and people that you don't know but have joined this journey across the Rio Grande. Imagine, and this is true, this really happened, that your 1.5-year-old falls out of the boat and goes under the muddy waters of the Rio Grande. And that someone who can't even swim, a man you don't know, dives in to the muddy waters afterwards to grab your child and lifts her up, possibly dying in doing so, and that someone then goes in after him and pulls him up. That tells you not only that these are courageous people, but they're willing to sacrifice themselves for a child. And then you get to the other side of that river where you are met by Border Patrol, and that the Border Patrol takes you into custody. You're wet, the children are wet, and they take you into a cell, and they turn down the air conditioning as low as it can go, so it's 50-something degrees in that cell. And you have a backpack full of a change of clothes, because when you left Nicaragua, you know that the multi-day journey that you're on is full of extreme temperatures. So you've brought clothes that are cool for when it's over 100 degrees outside, and you have also brought sweatshirts and such and sweaters for when it's cold and you need warm clothes. And you ask the Border Patrol, could you please give us our clothes? And they tell you no. Imagine that you say, can you at least bring my child some clothes, because the child is shivering and their teeth are chattering. And the Border Patrol says no. Now imagine that you say, can we at least have blankets? And they either tell you no, or they hand you a thin metal blanket that is crisp and cool, but will help retain your body heat. And they tell you, I'm sorry, we don't have these for everyone. Your family can share one of them. Imagine there are no beds, and that you, and this is the part where I get sad, just because I know it's true and I know the conditions and everything. And imagine that there are no beds, and so your child has to sleep on the floor, but of course you don't want them to. So you hold your child in your arms, sitting on a concrete bench all night, so that they can stay as warm as possible from your body. Now imagine that you get in after 7 o'clock at night, and your children are hungry and they're thirsty, and the Border Patrol says, I'm sorry, you've come after mealtime. You'll have to wait until breakfast the next morning. Remember the children who died? There were a couple of children who died, and it made the news last month and the month before. I knew exactly what had happened, because I've talked to so many kids and so many parents that I know the routine that many of those Border Patrol follow. And when I read about the little girl who had died, and I read that she had arrived in the early evening, I knew exactly what had happened. Or at least, I could imagine exactly what had happened. Imagine the next day that the officers come to you and they say, we need to take your child from you. And you say, no, I want to keep her with me. And they say, no, it's okay. We're going to give her a shower. Now think about that. What did the Nazis tell the parents when they took the children away? I mean, my God, whose idea was it to trick parents into giving their children up without a fight by promising to give them a shower? We know the history of the Nazis, and yet many of our government workers use the exact same line to get the parents to agree to hand over their children. And then imagine that they take your child away and she never comes back. Now I want you to imagine that you are that child and you have gone through that journey with your mom, and it's usually the mom, not always, but it's usually the mom who is, with the children coming across the border. Imagine that you're separated from your mom. She thinks that you're taking a shower, but in fact you're taken to another part of the facility where she can't see or hear you. And then at night, these are some of the blankets that are given to the children, but as I mentioned, not every child gets a blanket. So imagine that as a young child, after the night falls, while you've been separated from your mom all day, you are put into a van with darkened windows, and you're driven to a tarmac, and under the moon, when no one can see you and no one knows where you are, that they take you from that van with darkened windows and they put you into a bus with darkened windows. And you are in a giant bus full of other children, most of whom don't have a parent, but a few of whom do. And you're wondering, why do they get to be with their mom and I don't? Where is my mom? And then you drive all night long and all day long across multiple states. But you don't know this. You don't know where you are. And they take you to a bus terminal, and at the bus terminal, they take a quarter of the kids and load them into one van with darkened windows, and they take another quarter of the kids and they put them into another van with with darkened windows, and they do this until all the kids have been separated again into different vans, and they continue to drive, and they drop one kid off here, and 3 kids off there, and 4 kids off there, until finally, you yourself arrive in a Walmart parking lot. Now imagine, as that kid, that you are totally befuddled as to where your mom is, why you are where you are, why you are at this Walmart, and they take you inside and they give you a whole bunch of shots with a needle that really hurt without explanation about what the heck is going on. And then they make you walk in single files, wearing the same clothes that everybody else in the facility is wearing, back and forth 6 times a day, past a giant mural of Donald Trump that says, sometimes you have to lose the battle to win the war. What does that even mean? I mean, what is that message that they're trying to send the kids? Now imagine that in the same Walmart, there's another giant mural, but not as big, and that's a mural of the guy who founded this Walmart and other facilities like it, and is being paid over $1 million a year to lock you up in this Walmart for months and months at a time. And next to the mural of him are dollar bills. Except for these dollar bills that are on the wall don't have George Washington in the little oval in the middle. They have pictures of Juan. And if you ask someone, what are those? They'll tell you those are Juan dollars. And if you ask them, what are Juan dollar bills? They will say the employees who do what Juan wants them to do are rewarded with Juan dollars, and they can buy Juan swag. So you're kept in this facility inside this giant super Walmart for 9 months. 9 months. And in this facility, there is a wall of telephones, pay phones, where you and the people that you're being housed with in little dormitory-style rooms that have thin walls but no ceilings, so there's no privacy. One child said to me, "I am never alone, but I'm always lonely." And in that wall of telephones, they take you there twice a week, and they tell you, you can call your dad, but you still don't know where your mom is. You don't know if she's okay. You don't know where she's been taken. You receive no information about your mom, but you can talk to your dad for 10 minutes twice a week. This is what is really happening today. These kids are in that facility today. And this is what the government has done. In addition to that, in this facility, one of the things that they do is take children who are from the same indigenous tribe and speak the same indigenous language and then separate them. They don't keep them together. They separate them. You have no idea how many indigenous children we've talked to who said, there are only 2 people from my tribe here, and they moved them away from me, so I have no one to talk to. I am so lonely. And it's not just separating the children from the other people who speak their language, but they also say, you're not allowed to talk to anybody, or you're not allowed to touch anybody. So imagine you're a child. We know what calms children. Unless the child has an abnormality, it calms the child to be touched in a loving way, a loving and appropriate way. With infants, one of the best ways that you can develop an infant's connections in their brain is through touch. Like, children thrive on appropriate and loving touching. And these children aren't allowed to touch each other. They're not allowed to see family members. They're not allowed to touch staff. Staff are not allowed to touch them. And when I went into this facility with a number of experts, they said, my God, this is torture. These children are being tortured. On top of that, the children will open their pants and pull them away from their hips and say, look at all of the weight that I've lost. They never feed me enough. At the border stations, the children tell us about how they're given water that smells so putrid that they refuse to drink it because they know that it will make them sick, or that it's so strong with chlorine that they're afraid that the Border Patrol are trying to poison them because the chemicals are so strong. They talk about sandwiches that are rotten, and they talk about when they're not rotten, and sometimes they are rotten, they're frozen to the point that they are inedible. But even when they get into one of these facilities that are a little bit more in the interior and away from the Border Patrol station, they still talk about the fact that they're not fed enough food. And we then have to advocate that you must give the children enough food so that they don't lose weight, because they start to become so emaciated and lose their energy. On top of this, one of the things that I've heard from the children is not only about parents at the Border Patrol facilities trying to protect them from the cold, but them trying to protect each other from the cold. So that, for example, if we go back to a couple of these, and let me just say, I did not take these photos. These are not photos even from the current administration. These are from the Obama administration. But they show you that when people talk about the conditions under which the kids are being kept, this is called the Dogpen, that they're not exaggerating. Literally, we keep children in cages in this country, and these children, they haven't done anything criminal. These are children who are being detained in cages for doing nothing more but coming across the border without documentation, and most of them claim asylum almost immediately, which you're lawfully entitled to do. You're not allowed to come across the border without documentation, but the level of crime that is the same as playing your radio too loud. And what we do is we lock them up in cages, but as you can see here, what the children describe to us is that there are sometimes so many children in one of these cages that there's not enough room for them to all lie down at the same time, and so they will sleep in shifts. Or they talk about having the smallest children lie down, and the older children will sit on the benches in order to make sure that the children have enough sleep at night. Or they talk about holding siblings in their arms, and when there aren't enough mattresses, which often happens, they talk about having the older sibling lying down and putting the younger sibling on top of them so that they can keep them warm and insulate them from the concrete with their body. One of the other things that they talk about doing is this is not a Border Patrol station. I believe this is McAllen, which is one of the processing centers. And I'll tell you something about McAllen, and then I'll go back to talking about some of the things in the border stations. At McAllen last year, when the children and the parents started to be separated on a widespread basis, which no administration has done since the 1980s, the workers, the government workers, were so horrified because there was no way in America's system to track families. And so what they did was they started to track information about the child with relation to their family. So what village they came from, their parents' names, they assigned family ID numbers so that the children who were being separated from their parents could reunify them. When that list with this additional information made it to DC, what do you think happened? Yeah, they wiped it out. They wiped out the child's relationships with their family, who their parents were, so that, remember when when the judge in San Diego ordered that the children be reunited with their parents and the government couldn't do it? It's because they had destroyed all the records. They didn't have records for some of the kids, but in the cases where the frontline workers tried to solve the problem by making sure there was a family ID number, the higher-ups in Washington said, no, we don't want that information. And often, what we saw is that in addition to wiping out the child's parental identification or family identification, they also wiped out their birth date and made them born in America that day. They also often wiped out their nationality. They got rid of the place that they were from, where it really became a complete destruction of the child's identity and their affiliations, which, as we know, define us, a kind of cultural genocide. So going back to the border stations. So, another thing that the children do in order to care for one another is that in many of the border stations, there are no private toilets, and the children feel a great deal of shame having to urinate or defecate in front of each other, and so they describe trying to build privacy walls for each other by making a wall around one another with their backs to the person in order to allow them to retain their dignity in this, one of the most undignified situations, probably the most undignified situation that they'll ever be in. And unfortunately, we don't provide them with a sink to wash their hands afterwards. If there is a sink, there's no hot water. There's usually no soap. They don't give them toothbrushes and toothpaste. And then when you hear about the kids getting sick, you know why. Now, the kids are supposed to be released from the border stations almost immediately upon processing, but we talk to some children who are in the border facilities, which tend to have the most horrific conditions, for 4 or 5 days. And that's just not sanitary, with no showers, no way to wash their hands, no privacy in the toilet. Some of the toilets don't flush, and so the children have to fill up buckets with water and force the toilets to flush that way, manually. So, as you can see, we have this really horrific crisis on our hands in which we are treating thousands of children right now, today, in America, in clear violation of their rights. This is one of the buses that they've transferred the kids on. This is the Walmart called Casa Padre. And I am amazed because there is a whole set of rules about how you're supposed to care for children who are in government custody in America. And one of the rules is that you can't keep them in a locked facility. And when I got to the Walmart, unless they pose a serious threat to others, which virtually none of these kids do. They'll be in another facility. They won't be in the Walmart. But basically, we get to the Walmart, and everybody in our group has already received government clearance. A long time ago, everybody has impeccable credentials, and yet we get to the Walmart, and we literally have to go through 3 different barricades, both inside and out, to get to the children. And at every point, particularly inside, you have people standing there with their legs open and their shoulders back and their hands on their hips, standing in front of these doors, giving the children the impression that they are not free to leave, even though it's supposed to be an unlocked facility and they're supposed to be free to go anytime they want. And when we interview the staff say, oh yeah, they can go anytime they want. They're welcome to go. And yet, if you look at how hard it was for us to get in, and frankly, out again, you know that it's not truly an open facility. So they've really turned this Walmart into a jail. When I was down at the Walmart interviewing the kids and inspecting the facility, I knew that some of the separated parents were being detained not too far away, but they did not know where their children were, and the children did not know where their parents are, but in fact, they were within a half an hour drive of each other, even though they had been transferred there from several states away. When I was interviewing the kids, it was clear that they had been traumatized. When I was interviewing the parents, they were over the edge. They were just over the edge because they had no idea where their kids were. They thought that they were saving their children from a horrific situation, and now they had been locked up for months and months with no news about where their child was, or the ones who did have contact with the child would talk to the child and they'd find out that they had been placed in a home with strangers in the Midwest who did not speak their child's language, and that they were placed sometimes with other kids who were unrelated to the child, who might or might not have spoken their language, and the parents didn't know, was this man hurting their little girl? Or was this woman, for example, sometimes the foster parents were taking the kids to fundamentalist churches while they were there. And many of the children who are being detained are avowed Catholics. And some of them are, obviously indigenous, as I was talking about earlier. And so the parents were very worried about what their children were being exposed to and whether or not they were being hurt in the care of these strangers. That was bad enough, the separation. But then what happened was even worse, which is the American government called a press conference, got on live television, and said, once you come to America and we take your child away, you can't get your child back. There's no lawful way for us to remove them from the homes that they've been placed in. That's absolutely not true. Literally, the American government put out false information and tried to start a rumor itself that the government could take your child away for this crime that's no worse than turning your radio too loud and never give your child back to you. Well, guess what? People kept coming. They came anyway. So then the government started to interview families coming across the border and saying to them, did you know that we're going to take your child away and that we might never be able to give your child back? And the parents said, yes, we had heard about that. And the government said, well, why did you come anyway? And the parents said, because they were going to kill us. At least here they'll be alive. And so it was a complete failure. The pilot in 2017 was a failure, we're now finding out. It had no negative impact on immigration, but they expanded anyway. and adopted it as an official policy in early 2018, and it again failed, except for this time the American public found out about it. Another location that I've gone to is the Tornillo tent city. So let me tell you about Tornillo. So Tornillo has existed off and on for several years. And it was first created in order to absorb the significant increase in adolescent children who were coming across the border as unaccompanied minors during the Obama administration. And the fact is that we have a limited number of beds for these kids, but we need time to process them. We basically have 20 days under law to process them. And by under law, it's not a statute. It is an agreement in a class action suit called Flores that was brought against initially it was brought against the Reagan administration because they were doing similar things to the children in the 80s. And so in any event, so there was a settlement, and the government has to process children and place them promptly with their parents or with another family member residing in the U.S. If there are no parents or family member residing in the U.S. that they can be placed with, then Flores requires that the child be placed with an adult in the U.S. who is authorized by the parents to accept that child. And only then, only if you can't place the child in these three categories, can the U.S. government place them with a foster parent or in a residential center or some other place. But in the meanwhile, the court in Flores said, well, a reasonable amount of processing should normally be a few days, but in no event should it take you longer than 20 days to keep kids in these facilities. So as the Obama administration was trying to process all of these kids who were coming across the border by themselves a few years ago, they found they just did not have capacity. And so what they did was they hired a nonprofit that is a basically disaster relief nonprofit. And the disaster relief nonprofit normally goes into zones that are hit by a hurricane or an earthquake. They were at 9/11, and they set up, they've got all these tents and all this equipment, and they sent up a temporary site to provide people with tent housing and toilets and mess halls and stuff like that following a disaster or some other type of crisis. And the Obama administration said, hey, would you help us? We've got a border crisis. Could you send up a tent city so that we could process these kids so that we can keep them safe while we're processing them and placing them with families with their families in the United States? And this nonprofit said, sure, we'll help. Well, then what happened was last year, the Trump administration came to them and said, we've got a problem. We don't have enough space for all the kids that need a place to stay in the U.S. Could you set up a tent city for us? And the nonprofit said yes, they'd done this before. So they set up the tent city, they signed the contract, they set up the tent city, and then they, like the rest of us, find out that there's no increase in immigration of unaccompanied minors. That's not what's creating the crisis. What's creating the crisis is that the current administration is routinely separated children from their families and then keeping them. And all of a sudden, the nonprofit is like, we're the heroes. Like, we're former firefighters, we are police officers, we are teachers. Like, we help people who are in crisis. We don't hold kids hostage for political reasons. They said, we are terminating our contract. So the Trump administration went to them and they said, we will double your contract. We will pay you, I think their contract was like $250 million. And the Trump administration said, we'll give you $500 million if you will continue your contract and keep these kids at your tent, in your tent camp. And the CEO of the nonprofit said, I won't hold these kids hostage for $1 billion. What you're talking about is stupid and immoral, and we want no part of it. When this contract ends, this contract ends. And the next day, the President of the United States got on national television and said, the separated child policy was a mistake, and we're going to discontinue it. It shows you the power of one person to stand up to abusive, tyrannical behavior and say, no, you're not going to hurt another person under my watch. I will not be a part of it. The CEO is a Republican and always has been. So, in any event, the administration's contract ran out on Tornillo Tent City, was running out, and they were in wind down mode several months ago. So when I was at the Tent City in October, there was less than 1,000 kids there, and they had capacity for about 3,500 kids. And they were folding up the tents, and they were folding up the latrines, and the kids were being sent to relatives and other authorized adults in the U.S. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a call, and it was from a colleague in Flores, the lawsuit that I work on, and they said, we've got a problem. And I said, what's that? They said, we need you to come back to Flores. I said, why? And they said, they've got 2,500 kids. They are bringing them in by the busload in the middle of the night under the dark sky. And they start interviewing the kids, and the kids are being moved from the Walmart to Tornillo, to the tent city, where they're out in the middle of nowhere and being held indefinitely. Some of the kids had been there the entire time that Tornillo was open. And when we tried to figure out what is the holdup, nobody could tell us. Nobody could tell us why all of these administrations before had been able to process kids in a few days, almost never longer than 20 days, and yet it was taking this administration 9 months to place children, to release them. So at the end of the year, I don't know if you saw Tornillo closed down. Did anybody see that? That was because they told the administration, place these kids, we're leaving, we are packing up. And the administration had nowhere else to go, and the nonprofit held its ground and said, we ain't doing this. And that's why the tent city closed, is because the people on the front lines refused to make a profit off these kids and stood up to this administration. And suddenly, guess what? The administration was able to clear everybody. They were able to get the fingerprints done. They were able to run the criminal background checks. And oh, by the way, most of the kids were okay to go with their families after all. It all came together. So one of the saddest things about this whole crisis is that we invented it. When you hear the current administration talking about the border crisis, and let me be clear, I am not an open border advocate. I understand that it's the country's responsibility to manage our borders, but they've got to do it lawfully, and they have to do it humanely. When they tell you, when this administration tells you that we have a crisis at the border, those are your numbers. That's the number of apprehensions that we had on the border year before last when this policy started as a pilot. There is no crisis. In fact, when you look at where the where the immigrant population comes from in America today, most of them have been here living peacefully and productively for somewhere between 10 and 20 years. These are not recent immigrants, most of them. So where you do see a difference is in family apprehensions. Whereas we don't see an increase in apprehensions at the border overall, as a matter of fact, we have far fewer apprehensions than we've seen historically. What we are seeing is more family units coming across the border. Now, some of my colleagues get a list every single month of every kid who's coming across the border and has been detained by Border Patrol. And what we know is that the overwhelming majority of those families are young women, usually in their 20s, sometimes in their teens, with children. So we're not talking about these dangerous criminals that are being portrayed on some news outlets and by the current administration. We're talking about young women who are trying to escape with babies in their arms. You know, some of the babies are older than others, but they're all babies. Ask any mom or dad. In addition to that, you know, we've also been seeing an increase in unaccompanied minors coming across the border, but it's nowhere near 2014. So this is when the tent city was previously set up, was when we had a significant increase in accompanied minors coming across the border, and we didn't have enough beds for them. But those children were processed fairly quickly, and you know, were placed with family members very quickly. But the numbers that we have now, the year that they started these policies, are nowhere near that crisis that year. So a couple of lawsuits were brought based upon this. One was brought and the other one was being actively enforced. You know, when the separated child policy was first known to the public, when it was first confirmed. And this one was brought by the ACLU in San Diego. And basically what happened was the ACLU and Mizell versus ICE sued to have the children returned to their parents. We know that at least 3,000 kids were separated, but the fact is, we know because of the poor record keeping and the destruction of records by the government that there was probably far more than that, and that the government doesn't even know how many children they separated from their parents. And basically what happened in this was brought in federal court, is that the court ordered the government to reunify the children with their families. Unfortunately, going back to this, you know, as I explained earlier, because the government didn't keep track of which kids were with what parents, it proved to be far harder than anyone anticipated. And when the government was told that they would have to do that, the government said, well, the ACLU is rich, have them reunify the kids with their parents. And the judge said, no, the US government has to pay for this. And the government said, well, we just don't have the funds to do that, and we don't have the resources. And so the judge called everybody into chambers and said, how are we going to do this? How are we, clearly the government, it eventually became clear that the government didn't have the knowledge, that they didn't have the records to reunify children with their parents. They had sent many of the parents back to Central America. Many of the parents are trying to now hide from the gangs or whatever the threats were that sent them out of the country to begin with. And so what ended up happening is the ACLU had to bring in a coalition of nonprofits, and one of them is called Justice in Motion. Let me tell you about Justice in Motion. Justice in Motion was a nonprofit that was started because, believe it or not, there are employers in the US who will hire undocumented immigrants and the day before payday, report them to ICE. And so then they would be deported and they would not receive the pay that they had earned to send back to their families in their home countries. And so a young woman started Justice in Motion in order to develop contacts between the US and Central America so that she and her nonprofit firm could bring lawsuits against those employers, get the workers the money that they were owed, and then transfer that to the appropriate workers in their home countries. Well, because Justice in Motion developed what was called defender networks. So they put together networks that were embedded in the community. So these were, you know, lawyers and workers' rights advocates and such who they were already part of the community, so they would know who was there and who wasn't, and they gave them training. Well, because these defender networks were already developed in place in Central America to help with the recovery of employment payments that were owed cross-border, they said, let's see if Justice in Motion can use their defender networks in order to find the parents who were sent back to their home countries and in hiding. And so there ended up being this hierarchy of about half a dozen nonprofits who helped the government and the ACLU to try and find the parents both here in the United States and in Central America to try and reunify the separated families. And at this point, the government has not paid for many of the services that these nonprofits have provided to those families that were created out of what the government did. The second case that I want to tell you about is Flores. And so Flores is a case that I help on a limited basis, on a pro bono basis, and I take some of my students from the clinical law program on site visits with me. Right now, we are interviewing some of the families to find out what their experiences have been and their interactions with the government so that we can then prepare declarations and the Flores attorneys can file those in court so that we can enforce this lawsuit. And so basically what happened was in Flores, this was a suit that was brought, it was a class action suit that was brought in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. And basically, there was this young girl who was a teenager, and her parents had come to the United States trying to escape from the war in El Salvador. And she followed them up to the United States. And when she tried to be reunited with them, the U.S. government held her hostage in a hotel, trying to get the parents to come out and claim her so that they then could arrest the parents. So they kept her in this hotel indefinitely. The swimming pool was drained. There was, wired fencing all around. They put her with unrelated adult males in this hotel. They provided her with no education, no recreation, etc. And when this attorney in LA, Carlos Holquin, found out about it, he was horrified, and he called one of my mentors, Alice Boussier from the Youth Law Center in San Francisco, and said, we've got to do something. They're holding kids hostage and trying to use them as bait to get the parents. This is, inhumane. And basically, Carlos and Alice brought this lawsuit on behalf of these kids. In addition to Jenny in the Flores case being subject to strip searches, they found some other children who were being subject to, other girl children who were being subject to vaginal searches, by the government. And so they decided that they wanted to try and eliminate this kind of treatment of children who were in U.S. custody. This case went on for almost 10 years. And sometimes the government won, and sometimes the children won, and it went up to the Ninth Circuit, it went up to the Supreme Court, it came back down again, and finally, in the late 1990s, both sides said, hey, let's just agree on standards of care for children who are in U.S. custody, immigrant children who are in U.S. custody, and we'll just say that we'll make sure that the facilities are safe, and that they're sanitary, and that they're appropriate for children. Now, fast forward 20 years to what I told you 20 minutes ago. That's what I'm doing, is I'm going and I'm trying to see, are these facilities safe? Are they sanitary? Are they appropriate for children? And what does that even mean? And so they broke it down. What does it mean for them to be safe and sanitary and appropriate for children? It means that you have to have a toilet and a sink, but they don't always have those. It means that the children have to have drinking water. The Border Patrol will almost always bring the children drinking water. They won't always bring them juice. They'll only bring the youngest children juice, and then only on a limited basis. The little girl who died, a month and a half ago, she probably needed some juice when she arrived there. And I don't know the details of her care, but I've interviewed enough kids to know that there's a very good chance that she needed juice and they did not give it to her, that she needed food and they did not give it to her because of the routines that they have. But they're supposed to give them water, and when they do give them water, again, we hear from the children that the water is putrid, that or it smells like chlorine, or they say chemicals. Sometimes they say chlorine, sometimes they say chemicals. They're supposed to give them food. They're supposed to give them medical assistance, which we know that they're not doing. That they're supposed to have adequate temperatures and ventilation where they're kept, which we know they're not doing. One of the facilities where the kids are being routinely kept, they refer to as the ice box. And the other facility that the children routinely refer to, they refer to as the dog pound. And you saw why, because of the cages and the wires that are kept around them. And then they're supposed to receive adequate supervision, and the children are supposed to have contact with their family members who were, especially the ones that they were with when they were apprehended, but they are supposed to be segregated from adults that are not related to them. I mentioned to you earlier that the children are supposed to be released almost immediately, and that the judge in this case, which is a federal judge in LA, the judge in San Diego, that was a federal judge as well, but the one in LA, Dolly G, she has interpreted this to be no more than 20 days. If you can't figure it out in 20 days, we've got a problem. And so normally, almost no children are ever kept more than 20 days, and oftentimes they're released in half that time, sometimes less. And the order of preference that the government has to follow is parents, that you need to place the child with a parent. And if you can't place the child with a parent, you need to place the child with another adult living in the United States. And if you can't do that, only then can you put them in a licensed program, such as a foster home or a residential center. And even within that, there's a preference for place them with in a normal family setting, down to a group setting. Well, one of the things that happened while this was going on is that at the same time that Mizell versus ICE was being litigated by the ACLU, Flores was being actively litigated by Carlos Holquin and by the other lead attorney on the case, Peter Shea. And we tried to enforce Flores and get the government to stop doing what they were doing, because it was all, so much of it was in violation of Flores. And one of the things that happened is Jeff Sessions tried to set aside the settlement, and he tried to argue that, we didn't need that, and that, we didn't need the lawsuit, we didn't need the settlement, and that we needed to be able to place the kids on military bases, similar to the Tornillo tent camp, but on a widespread basis. And he tried to say, we've got so many kids coming into this country, and the facilities are full. Well, I happened to be at the largest residential family center that day when he said that. And I said, that's strange. We have capacity here for 2,400 people, and right now, we are only at 62% capacity. And they said, well, we used to be at a much higher capacity. We were full just a few months ago, and I was like, let me check my notes, because I was here 6 months ago, and you were at 64% capacity. So I was able to send a declaration. I'm, in the camp itself, and I'm, trying to get this declaration written on a portable printer and a portable computer and everything, and get it sent to LA, and it got filed in time, and Dolly G says, motion denied. In addition to that, the Flores attorneys representing the kids asked for a special master to be appointed, because things are so out of control with regard to this administration that basically they argued we need a full-time authority simply to enforce the terms of Flores. And the judge agreed. And now there is somebody who all they do all day, every day, is try and hold the Trump administration accountable for adhering to those very simple standards of how we care for children in care. And then I've already told you about the nonprofit BCFS refusing the $1 billion contract to house the separated children. In addition to that, and then we're going to take a break, the government has basically proposed regulations to interpret Flores. So basically, the Flores settlement was never intended to be permanent. Basically, the Clinton administration settled it, and they were supposed to develop regulations that made Flores part of the executive branch's regulations, and they never did. And then the Bush administration was supposed to develop the regulations, and the Bush administration never did. So the Flores standards and the settlement agreement continued on uninterpreted by anybody else. And then the Obama administration came along and they were supposed to write the Flores regulations, and they didn't either. So we get stuck with the Donald Trump administration interpreting Flores. And these regulations bear no resemblance to what those simple guidelines say, that children need to be in a safe place, in a sanitary place, and in conditions that are appropriate for children with adequate supervision. So the regulations that the Trump administration has put forward is that they can detain children forever and a day. There is no end to how long they can keep these kids locked up. They also don't want to have to keep them in licensed facilities. The way that Flores has been written, you have to keep, and interpreted, you have to keep the kids in licensed facilities. But they're so bad that no one will license them. Not even Texas will license these facilities. They're so bad. And then they want flexibility with regard to the standards of care. The standards of care are that you have to give a child a toilet. How much flexibility do you need? That you have to give a child water, that you have to give them adequate food. You don't need flexibility on that. Children are taken away in this country from parents who don't give their children enough water and food. Those are pretty basic. In addition to that, they want to make sure that the minute that the children turn 18, that they no longer enjoy any of the protections that they were given as children. And the reason why this is important is that many of the children start a process for asylum when they are minors, and they need to be able to continue through that process and not automatically be transferred into an adult system where the day that they turn 18, they're subject to deportation. And so if they start the process as a minor, they need to complete that process, which gives them special protections that adults don't get. So the attorneys in Flores are now trying to convince the Judge G that these regulations as proposed are not consistent with the Flores standards. And with that, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to go through some of the lessons that we've learned from this, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion. So 10 minutes, is that right? Okay. Okay, I've got a green light, so I think we're good. Okay, so in this journey of going and interviewing these kids and interviewing these parents and seeing the facilities in which they've been kept and watching, sometimes having a virtual front row seat on this litigation in which we're challenging this inhumane treatment, I started to realize a few things. And the first lesson that I learned is that it's so important to believe in the goodness of people. Because at the same time that I'm seeing some of the most horrific things that I've ever witnessed, I'm also seeing mass protests pushing back. People who don't know the parents or the children who say, no, you need to put these families back together. This is wrong. And going to some of the detention facilities where the parents are being kept, going to the children's facilities where the children are being kept. There's one man who in Tornillo, until the day that it closed, stood out in front of the tent camp every single day, all day long, and it said, "Let the children go home." And that's just what he did all day, every day. Every person who drove in knew that there was one person, the children saw that sign, the workers saw that sign, and they knew that people cared about them. Lesson 2 is that we have to identify what we share in common with other people, and we need to build our relationships and our coalitions and our alliances and our relationships around those. When I first entered into the political world as an 18-year-old, actually I entered it as a teenager working on some campaigns. I was raised in fundamentalist Christian schools, as some of you know, and it's like I was a Republican when I started out. During this last presidential election, most of my life I then became an independent or one of the minor parties, but I became a Democrat. I think it was the month that Donald Trump was chosen as a Republican nominee, because I was so horrified by what he stood for. And yet, and then I became very outspoken because of how children were being treated. And when I talked to my Republican family members, they all told me, I agree with you on this issue. I don't agree with you on a lot of things, but I agree with you on this. And this person is a Republican who is a Mormon father of 9. And he has a stay-at-home wife, and he has a business that he owns and runs, which is a disaster relief technological platform. And when I had a message where I was trying to recruit people to go to the Walmart visit with us, when I sent out that message and it was forwarded to someone who knew him, someone contacted me and said, hey, I have a friend who might have a technological platform that he can help you to figure out who these kids are and match them with their parents. And they put me in touch with him. And he said, after talking to me for a long time, he said, my platform won't be able to handle this, but I think I know whose platform would. And then he called the person who owns the platform that the United Way uses and the American Red Cross uses and FEMA uses when there are disasters and they're trying to reunify families and everything. And he talked that person into donating that platform. And then he said, I used to work for that company. I will donate my time to set up that platform and adapt it so that we can download all the children's information into that database, and we can download all the parents' information into that database, and we'll add a fundraising component, and we'll add a volunteer component so people can sign up to help these children and families. And I said, could you meet me in LA tomorrow? I'm in Oregon. He's in Colorado. And he said, I'll be on the first flight. And the next morning, we both got off of planes at like 8:30 in the morning, and we got into a rental car, and we drove up to Peter Shea's house, and we built that platform. You have to figure out what you have in common and not judge people based upon shallow litmus tests. We have far more in common as human beings who have hearts and souls than we give ourselves credit for. So let's figure out what we have in common and build our relationships around those. In addition to that, here's a picture of Peter Shea. I have no idea how old Peter Shea is, but I'm assuming he is probably somewhere in his 70s. When I first walked in on him, he was designing a new website. And I'm like, Peter, what are you doing? I've got the New York Times on the phone. Rachel Maddow wants to interview you tonight. I forget what the magazine was, wants to do a profile on these kids, and you're designing your own website. Like, you have to be open to innovating, to trying new things, to, exploring new solutions on new platforms in new ways. You've got to be able to innovate because things are changing rapidly around us, and if we're not creating good through innovation, we won't be able to fight the evil that can spread through innovation. And so embrace innovation and use it for goodness. Now, we did get Peter to stop trying to set up his own new website, but the fact that he was even trying to do it is admirable. And, and as we tried to innovate it too, there's Aaron Titus, the dad I was telling you about, the dad of 9, behind as we're trying to get this set up. But the important thing is that we can figure out who the best people on the team are to do what things, but we need to be open-minded about the fact that we're going to have to do things differently in today's battles. We absolutely have to work together. One of the things that was so impressive upon me is that everybody had a role. So that, for example, when we were at the Walmart, that when people found out who we were, they would deliver free food to us so that they would only allow us to interview the kids for so many hours a day for so many hours. And so we never wanted to leave and get a bite to eat or take a break or anything. And so when some of the local restaurants found out what we were doing, they would send us food, and they would tell us, if you come to our restaurant, at 7 o'clock or whenever they kick you out, we will give you all free dinners. That we each have to figure out what it is, the role that we have. I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to try and exploit the lawyer roles in which I can have an impact. You might be a doctor, and we had doctors on our teams in order to evaluate the medical care that the children were given. You might be a yoga provider, and so a yoga instructor. I had yoga instructors contact me. I had firefighters contact me. I had former military, all sorts of people, but we literally had yoga instructors who were saying, I will lead a yoga session to help your team cope with the stress of being exposed to so much, so many sad stories and so many toxic stories at the end of the day. Figure out what your role is and then figure out how to work with others, because it's only when we each in our role resist evil that we're going to be able to overcome it. So we've got to figure out how to work together. And that includes, making sure that you understand that children have a role to play too, because it's oftentimes the children's voices that can be the most powerful. And then here, actually, this is what his sign says: free them. Just 2 words: free them. This is the gentleman who stands outside of Tornillo every day, and you could see how weathered his skin has become by, taking that simple stand. And even if you have to take a stand alone, take it, because it was only through the president of that nonprofit or the CEO of that nonprofit saying, no, I will not hold kids hostage for $1 billion, that the separated child policy finally was ended by this administration. So even if you're alone, know that it can matter. And then lesson number 6 is to trust Mr. Rogers. When bad things are happening, look for the helpers. There will always be helpers. And we each have the potential to be a helper, each in our own way. So thank you. So someone's going to come up and get the mic so that we can all hear one another, and I'm going to move over to this mic. Here's some ideas about how you too can be a helper, but I want to leave enough time for questions. Questions, comments?
I'm Paul. Having had a federal career in this government shutdown, what kind of complications do you see that at the border when there isn't the support for even those governments that are like ICE and so forth? They have certain administrative things they have to do to get anything done, whether good or bad. What kind of impact do you see this on what's going on at the border?
I mean, I think it's hard to say. I think the government shutdown has created instability in many administrations. I don't mean like, the executive administration, but in the administration of many of the services that are impacted by it. And so obviously we have a situation where the standards of care for the children are already not being met, and the standards of supervision are already not being met. And, I imagine that what's going to happen is, in talking to some of the federal workers I know who are not getting paid, that they are preparing their resumes and thinking about other jobs because of the unpredictability of the government at this point in history. And so that will mean that you're going to have more chaos in how the border is being managed. And, and with chaos and children being a part of a chaotic environment, it creates opportunities for abuse and neglect. And so I think that the government shutdown places these children at even higher risk of abuse and neglect than they already are experiencing.
This is Lucy. I read an article recently about the CEO of Southwest Key, which is a nonprofit that I know runs the McAllen facility, and the profits that his little nonprofit are reaping off of this. Can you talked about a nonprofit that refuse to participate, but it sounds like this Southwest Key is participating and reaping huge financial rewards for the individual who calls himself El Presidente on signage on some facility there. Can you speak to the Southwest Key program?
Yeah, so the Southwest Key program runs the Walmart. And one of the things that surprised me and some of the other people that did the evaluation with me is that the Walmart, at least during the first visit, was even worse than the tent city. And we had not expected that. We thought the tent city was going to be the worst facility that we saw, but our impression of the people at the tent city, and as I mentioned, those were largely former police officers and also current, they also are staff. The BCFS facility, which is the Tornillo tent city, they have people who take leave from their job and then they work at this facility for a few weeks. So some of them are current, some of them are former, but that's where you see a lot of the frontline providers, responders, first responders, excuse me. And they really were trying their best to care for these kids in incredibly difficult situations. So a couple of examples of this is that they contacted Build-A-Bear and asked Build-A-Bear to donate teddy bears to all the kids and to allow the kids to design their own bears so that they would have something that they could hold on to as they were experiencing this trauma. Another thing that they did was they built a soccer field for the kids, and the soccer field in the middle of the desert was way nicer than the soccer field at the Casa Padre at the Walmart, and it's interesting because when we talked to the kids at Casa Padre, they said that they hardly ever were allowed to go outside. Almost none of the kids. I don't know that I spoke to any of the kids who had ever left the facility, and even though they told us that they routinely took the kids out from the facility, and the kids said, no, that's not true. I've never gone, never left this building in the 9 months that I've been held here, at the tent city, the kids were outside a lot. They were outside all the time, and they were outside so much to the point that they felt like they were not receiving an education. And the reason they were not receiving an education is because the government told the contractors they weren't allowed to educate the kids because this was only a temporary facility where they were placing the kids until they could be placed with their relatives. And so they said this was not part of the Flores settlement, and they tried to tell us that too, that it was not part of the Flores settlement, and so they didn't even need to allow us to be there and inspect the facility. We had a right to meet with our clients, but we did not have a right to inspect the facility. And so there were no educational or very limited educational opportunities for the kids. And so, these workers were doing their best to give the kids things to do because the government wasn't allowing them to educate the kids. One of the things that they tried to do is they noticed that some of the kids were not totally happy, and so some of the girl children, they said, what do you want to do? Let's plan an event. And the girl said, well, can we have a fashion show? And so you had all of these like macho masculine firefighters and police officers and military organizing this fashion show for the kids so that they could feel really good about themselves and, making nice clothes for each other and things like that. So there was a humanity that we witnessed at Tornillo that we did not see at the Casa Padre, which was run by, he calls himself also, in addition to El Presidente, Father Juan. So we did not see that same humanity. We actually saw a deeply concerning inhumanity at that facility, and then when you look at the financials behind Southwest Keys, that's also the facility that had the children in Phoenix, Arizona, in the office warehouse in Arizona, where some of the children were being abused. So highly profitable, with extreme 7-figure salaries being given to the executives, and on top of that, he owns part, he or his wife owns part of the Walmart facility, and then they lease it back to the nonprofit. So there's all of this insider dealing that's going on with the facilities that are being used by Southwest Keys. Very, very corrupt nonprofit organization, and I mean one that, I think should lose its license. I mean, I think that the government should stop contracting with them, and that they should lose their license. And they talk about, they're like, this is the largest facility of its kind in the world, and it's like, that's not bragging rights, honey. That ain't bragging rights.
This is Bob. My question relates to the varying ages and needs of the children based on age. I've been concerned, as long as I've been following the story, about the youngest, who would be the most disoriented, the most incapable of understanding what is going on with them, and also need probably more than the older kids comfort and sensitive attention. Is there any difference in the federal regulations or in the Flores agreement concerning how we treat these children?
You mean based upon age?
Based upon age.
So no, not really. I mean, one of the practices with the, we do see the government inconsistently treating the younger children differently than the older children, so that, for example, the younger children were more likely to have a parent with them on the bus. But what was frustrating for some of the children is that they would see children their age with their parent, and they didn't understand why, that 6-year-old was still with their parent, but they're 6 and they're not. The other thing is that at some of the Border Patrol stations, they'll give young children juice, but they won't give older children juice. And they seem to be somewhat arbitrary on where they draw the line between younger children and older children. With the younger children, they are more likely to keep those children in the same cell as the parent, whereas generally for children that appear to be around, 9, 10, 11 and up, they put them in a separate cell. And I want to challenge something that you are saying. So you talked about, the younger children might be more traumatized than the older children, and that might be true in some situations, but we do ourselves a disfavor when we fail to understand the amount of love and attention and security that adolescents need. That's a really, really difficult period in life, and because their bodies have gotten bigger, we often think that they're tough and they don't need as much from us, and they're being driven through their maturation to pull away from us at times, and that makes us think like they're okay, but then they need to come back to us and touch base with us and have the security of their parents or their loved ones, their families, and then that gives them the confidence they need to go even farther away. And what can happen is if we fail to realize the needs of adolescent children and we don't give them the ability to reconnect, it can cause them to go backwards in their development and then to never really have the confidence to trust the world. It's so important in adolescence for kids to know that they can leave their parents and be okay. And when they leave their parents and do something that's really courageous and then are abused in the process, they might lose that courage to ever engage with the world again. So I absolutely agree with you that we tend to be much more sympathetic towards young children, but I think we do so and sometimes hurt adolescents by failing to realize just how vulnerable they are as well.
Have either of our state's senators made any real difference in the efforts that they've put forth to make a trip down there or do whatever?
I mean, yeah, I'm hearing Merkley's voice out there. I think that he has been the most outspoken. So one of my criticisms about how this crisis has been managed is that we don't have this on the front page every day. And this is a horrific situation in which we are committing human rights violations against these children, and that some of the harms will be irreparable, and that it should be front page news. And I think Senator Merkley, more than anybody else, has done his best to keep this on the front page. Now, whether or not that's going to make a difference, I don't know, but I did receive an email this morning, and the judiciary is looking into how these kids are being treated. So would this, would and I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember if it was the House Judiciary or the Senate Judiciary Committee, but I don't care which one. The fact is that those people like Senator Merkley who are keeping this on the front page need to be praised and encouraged to continue to do so, so that when the congressional leaders are trying to establish their priorities, that these kids and the way that they're being treated is challenged and eventually ended.
Pat here. I'm wondering. Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, it's supposed to be me. All right, I'm Sally Hopkins. The thing that crossed my mind, I taught elementary school at 2 or 3 different cities. But anyway, at one point, I taught a lot of ESL children. Well, they were ESL because they came over from Vietnam. They didn't know anybody. Mm-hmm. They started out in first grade. I had ages 5 to 14, all in the first grade. And there were like 7 of these little children. The thing is, I'm wondering, tears, 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 and tears. It comes naturally. And I can just imagine what this gang of kids would do. And I cannot imagine how these people could stand and just ignore it. It has to really get to you to just listen to them and listen. And all of the Americans would have to do, I mean, all the children, not Americans, but all the children would have to do this to be able to cope.
I absolutely agree. And I think, as I said during my presentation, the one thing that I wasn't prepared for was the parents. I just assumed that the amount of pain that I was seeing from the children was not going to be matched by the parents. I imagined the parents were in pain, but I really, really underestimated just how devastated those parents were whose children had been taken away. And, and I think that part of what was hard for the parents, I do a lot of work with survivors, and because of the number of people who come up to me and tell me, that they have been raped, that they've been assaulted, that they had been, sexually abused as children and things like that, I think I've kind of developed a sixth sense when I'm talking to somebody. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the children are disoriented and they don't really understand what's going on. The parents know what's going on, and they know what could be happening to their child, and knowing is almost more frightening than not knowing. And so in some ways, it's hard for the parents because many of them have seen the worst of it, and that's probably why they left. And I just can't imagine some of these moms that I've interviewed who appeared to be survivors, who now know that their children are with a strange man day in and day out in the privacy of their home, and they don't know who he is or where he is and what he is doing to their 4-year-old girl.
Pat here. I was wondering, the kids who have lost their identity, that have been stripped of it, what happens to them?
Who knows? I mean, you've seen the news the last couple of weeks where the government is admitting that they don't even know how many kids they've separated. There are, there are advocates who, there was a big deal before the separated child policy became really big. There was a big deal about the fact that the government had lost track of children in their care, and there were advocates who were saying, it's good. We want the government to lose track of these kids. We want these kids to be with their families underground somewhere and the government not tracking them. I think there are pros and cons to that, but now what we're really starting to appreciate is that on a widespread basis, partially as a result of this new policy that was intentionally inhumane for deterrent purposes, that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of kids whose identities are lost and we don't know who they are, where they're from, who they're with, they have been lost in the system. And that, like when we talked about how the government shutdown can increase the vulnerability of these children to abuse and neglect, stripping a child of their identity, of their social network, you are absolutely placing them at risk of, exploitation.
This is Danny. I have a question. I was wondering where you got the photos in your presentation, where they came from, and I have a larger question about access. Who gets to go into these facilities? Who do you get to talk to? Who can't you talk to? What kind of procedures do you have to follow to get through the doors?
Yeah, so basically the photos I asked for some of my students who went with me to the facilities to find pictures. So I said, get me a picture of a bus that kids are on, make sure that they're not subject to any, intellectual property protections. Get me, a picture inside of McAllen. Get me a picture of Casa Padre. So they got the pictures online, and that's when I was saying earlier, like, these are not pictures that I've taken. We're not allowed to have our phones in there. They search us. We go through all sorts of security controls. So these are generally, I think, media have taken most of these pictures, and then, there were no licenses attached to them. Or at least that's what I'm hoping, because that's what I told my students to do, is find me pictures I can use legally.
Hi, my name is Franca Hernandez. I have a question, but before the question, I have a small comment. I've been boycotting Walmart since 2000, and you're just giving me another reason why I'm going to continue to boycott them. My comment was about the United Nations. I mean, there are international global standards on how to treat children that are incarcerated, or situations like the children on the border. I've heard nothing about the United Nations making any kind of resolution expressing an abhorrence of what's going on. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons. The first thing I want to do, though, is, I'm not an investor in Walmart. I don't shop there very often. But I will say that Walmart does not own this property. I refer to the Walmart because it was a building that was designed as a super Walmart. And when you go into this building, it is still a super Walmart, but we are selling children. Like, we have sold these children to Father Juan El Presidente. And when we were interviewing, the children, one of my partners, I have this wonderful, wonderful partner that I like to go on these site visits with. He's from Human Rights Watch, and he said, we were in the room, and he says, why is it so cold here? And I said, haven't you ever been to a super Walmart? And he said, no. I said, he's from London and New York City, and I said, this is the freezer section. Like, all super Walmarts are the same. So even though the super Walmart had been sold to, El Presidente, the CEO of Southwest Key, years ago, it still looks and feels like a super Walmart, but Walmart's not running this facility. Southwest Key is what we should not only be boycotting, but we should be trying to shut down, because they are making millions of dollars off of the exploitation of these children. So with regard to international action, we don't have to look to international law for enforcement. We have it. That's what the ACLU was relying on. That's what the Flores attorneys are relying on. We have domestic laws that we can rely on. As far as the international treaties regarding juvenile detention, the U.S. hasn't signed that. We're the only country in the world, and you guys have heard me say this like 6 times now. What country in the world has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? There's only one. You think? No. We contributed more language to that treaty than any other country that was participating in that drafting process, which was 10 years. 10 years. We contributed more language to it, and we contributed more amendments to other countries' contributions to it than any other country in the world. And when it came down to it, we signed it under tremendous pressure, and that was Clinton. Somebody was saying, we need to make clear that people understand this is across multiple administrations. Absolutely true. You know, in the same way that Reagan did things that were wrong with regard to children, Clinton did things that were wrong with regard to children, Bush did things that were wrong, Obama did things that were wrong, Trump is doing things that are wrong. In my opinion, you know, from the, you know, between the 80s and today, President Trump is doing way more that's wrong on a much more flagrant basis than the other three presidents that have come between Reagan and this administration. But, you know, going back, the thing is that we are violating the law openly and flagrantly. We're violating domestic laws and international laws, and we are being condemned by other countries for it, but there's not any enforcement for treaties that a country hasn't signed. And we haven't signed the treaties on the juvenile detention treaties, and we haven't signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. What we have signed is the Treaty on Trafficking of Children, and I think I've already spoken to you on that, and if I haven't, then you can bring me back another year and we can talk about that. But, you know, this is not one of the areas that is regulated in the United States, except for that there are human rights treaties that are implicated, and there is, without question, massive violations of these children's human rights.
I'm afraid I took the microphone to the next person without Danny getting the rest of his question about how you gain access. Remember, he was to the facilities. Who did you have to talk to? What was that your question, Danny? He's not here. I thought he was. Yeah.
So I was invited. So before this became a big deal.
By whom?
I mean, it was always a big deal to me, but before it became a big deal to the American public, before the American public realized what was going on, I was invited to do this, and so was doing it at the time that it became front page news. And then with some of the higher profile facilities, you know, I was one of the people that was handpicked. And I'll tell you, I have the most wonderful husband in the world, because we have, I've been pretty busy the last few years, and I bought him a trip to Paris for his birthday this year. And I got the whole family tickets, and I bought them like 9 months ahead of time. And then the week before his birthday, I said, honey, are you okay going to Paris without me for your birthday? Because the U.S. government has scheduled the site visit at the Walmart for the day we're supposed to leave for Paris. And he said, oh, honey, I knew you weren't coming anyway. So 20 years, you learn about a person. And so I did, I did leave. I did fly in directly from the Walmart, to Paris. I didn't come back to Oregon. And I got there in time for the World Cup, but I missed his birthday. Bless his heart.
Hi there, this is Cassia. You mentioned early on in your talk that one of the reasons that they separated the kids from the parents was they did a criminal history check of the parents. And that's been a thing that's been in the papers a lot, about how many illegal criminals we've got coming across the border and so forth. And I'm interested in knowing, how on earth did they manage to do the actual criminal background check? And are these active felonies supposedly in this country or in the country that they came from? And do we have legal connections with other countries so that we can reach into their criminal databases to determine if these are active felons, as you put it, as opposed to people who've had a crime and then paid their time and otherwise would not be considered criminals? How does that work anyway?
It doesn't. So,
okay,
so in talking to some of the nonprofits that are doing the cross-border work and trying to reunite the children, you know, the U.S. government will say, well, we took this child away because the parent is a felon in El Salvador, and the nonprofit will pull the history in El Salvador, and the parent is not a felon in El Salvador. And that has played out repeatedly. Certainly, they can run a background check if the person has been in the United States before and they're a known, felon here in the United States, and that, they do those every day. But what we found is that a lot of their background checks in their home countries are unreliable, except for, kind of the highest profile criminals. And so, we either the government is doing a really bad job or they're lying about it. I like to think the best of people. So on the one hand, we do want to protect children from being in the custody of people who are dangerous, but we now know that this was not to protect children from felons. It was to try and keep these children out of the United States. I wanted to say something else about your question. The background checks.
Statistics, people come numbers of actual felons coming in, any idea about that? And the language issue, I didn't mention that before, but it seems to me
Yeah.
languages would play a big role in being able to communicate with either adults or kids.
Yeah, so language is a big issue. I think what stands out in my mind is that the administration tries to portray a lot of these parents as dangerous, and having met and interviewed, these parents, these are just many of them are just the meekest, kindest, young, just young people trying to survive. Again, most of them female. And I'm thinking that the whole portrayal of these as drug lords, it's these little moms are like El Chapo, in the eyes of the administration. And I'm like, they're not even $1.20. They don't even weigh $1.20. It's like they're tiny little people who literally have babies in their arms. And I was like, this is not a threat to national security. This does not justify a $5 billion border wall. You want to do something? Overhaul those border stations so that they have toilets and sinks where the kids can wash their hands. And why don't you get some juice boxes? But it's, so kids aren't dying in our care. But it's, I think that, the criminal, I absolutely support separating children from dangerous individuals. And when we have reliable information that they're dangerous individuals, I support the government removing them. But when they're trying to make it sound like, all of these mom are dangerous criminals, and that's why we need a $5 billion border wall, and that's why we have to take these 2-year-olds away and the 12-year-olds away, don't lie to me.
Hi, my name is Karen. I think I'm a little confused, and I would like to just make sure I understand the bottom line, because what you're directing me to do there is to share my information on social media and with family and friends and so forth, and also to do something like writing Merkley or write whoever I can. But I need to have the bottom line and the bottom line information on that, because when I read all the sources I have, including The Economist, which I trust, I don't get good information. I got some today from you. So the bottom line is that Trump did separate a whole bunch of children from their parents, and we have a problem there as far as getting them back and all of that. But that's done. We're not doing that anymore, correct? Now wait.
I have no idea whether we are or not. I have no idea what this government is doing, because I have a crisis of trust that is so profound that I do not trust it anymore.
So I can write and say, we're holding children, we're still separating children from their parents. We need it to stop. We need them to have good facilities while they are being held. And what they should be holding to is that Flores commitment. That's only 20 days that they're held, and so forth and so on. That's the bottom line. Is that correct?
Yes, and so let me tell you what we're doing now. So I've been asked to chair a coalition of professional societies. So this is through APSAC, which is the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. They're trying to organize the American Medical Association. They're trying to organize the American Academy of Pediatrics, et cetera, and so on, so that we can support lawmakers in DC, so that we can support them with research-informed expert testimony, so that they draft legislation that not only ensures that the Flores standards are consistently implemented, and not just through the case law, but through the actual, through legislation passed through Congress and signed by the president, but that we actually meet standards that meet the children's state-of-the-art care practices. That what was negotiated 20 years ago was so basic and so minimal. We now really understand the trauma that detention of children causes them, and we also understand the separation, the trauma that separation causes them, and we need to make sure that we have completely independent, nonpartisan experts meeting with members of Congress and testifying at the hearings that we expect to see from the judiciary so that they have research-informed legislation drafted this session that can ensure that this ends. So if you're going to ask for anything, I think you need to ask them to draft legislation that ends facilities like Tornillo and Casa Padre forever, and establishes research-informed standards of care for the children who are in U.S. custody. I think that is the ask on January 23rd, 2019. So I remembered what I wanted to say. I'll come back to you in just a second. I remembered what I wanted to say about the criminal background checks and things like that. So one of the things that we were told about why the kids were spending so much time in Tornillo, they were only supposed to be there a few days, so this was supposed to be like their final processing spot, and many of the kids were there the whole time. A number of the kids were there the whole time. And what we were told is that they were getting caught up in fingerprinting. So normally what would happen is when under the Obama administration they were trying to place a child, they would do a background check on the sponsor only, and if the sponsor passed a background check, the fingerprinting and background check, then they would release the child to that sponsor. What happened under Trump is that they separated the kids, kept no records of who the parents were, and then had to match them all back together. And so they were having to do all this DNA, they were having to do all these fingerprints and all these background checks from the separated child crisis, which completely created a backlog for the normal kids processing. To exacerbate that, what they then did was they subjected every person in the sponsor's household to fingerprinting and a background check. Well, we know that many of those households are mixed status, that some of the people in the household are documented and others are not. And so then they would have people like moving out of the household, or they'd try and get other relatives to come forward and everything. But even when they didn't have mixed status households, which placed some people at risk because they didn't know what the Trump administration was going to do with the information they were collecting, what happened is that you had the back up from the separated child crisis and trying to reunite those families with the fact that now instead of doing a background check for one person, you were doing a background check for 6 people or 8 people or 9 people, and that takes a lot more time. And so it was partially the interaction between all of those factors that kept kids waiting 6 months instead of 20 days to be with their dad.
I think what concerns me is that...
Do you have the mic?
Professor Binford, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and sharing all of your information today.
You're welcome.
We are probably shocked at what you say, but it's the truth. So thank you so much.
Thank you.